Welcome everybody to the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Public Theology Symposium, the challenge of public theology in turbulent times, how we still of any use, honouring the academic vocation of the Reverend Dr. Katie Day. I'm going to turn it over now to President Guy Irwin, the President of United Lutheran Seminary.
Thank you. It's a delight to be able to welcome you all to this forum. It's an important topic, a very pertinent question, and an extremely significant day on which to be holding this forum as we remember the life and death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the most important public theologians of the 20th century. And of course, it's wonderful for us here at United Lutheran Seminary to be able to honor our dear colleague, the Reverend Dr. Katie Day, the Charles A. Schieren Professor Emerita of Church and Society. Dr. Day contributed to the life of this seminary in so many ways and left behind an entire legacy of students who benefited from her teaching, colleagues who miss her very much, and a community that is glad that she's still a part of it in this new extended way. The pandemic has prevented us from celebrating her in all the ways we would otherwise have done, but this forum is a fitting way to do that as well. I want to acknowledge that in this group today, quite a large group of over 200 registrants, we have people among us from not only across the United States, but around the world, in fact. There are people in our midst from Brazil, from Canada, the Czech Republic, Germany, India, Mongolia, the Philippines, South Africa, South Korea, Switzerland, Thailand, and the United Kingdom, both England and Scotland. And I'm sure there are others I might have missed. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to the members of the Executive Council of the Global Network for Public Theology, who are with us for a time. It's wonderful to be part of this network that promotes public theology, all theology that has an impact on our lives and shaping and reshaping our understanding is, in a sense, public theology. And I rejoice to be able to join you all today and look forward to learning from our distinguished keynote speaker and the other speakers, and to offer my own warm congratulations and greetings to Dr. Day, the honoree. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, President Irwin, and thank you all for joining us. I am Storm Swain. I am the Frederick Borsch Associate Professor of Anglican Studies, Pastoral Care and Theology here at United Lutheran Seminary, and I am your host today. You will have seen the directions about the symposium on the previous screen. I encourage you to have a side-by-side where you can see both speaker and PowerPoint, but we are really delighted that you are here. So our gathering is titled The Challenge of Public Theology in Turbulent Times, How Are We Still of Any Use? And we are delighted to have our keynote speaker, Dr. William Storrar, who is going to frame, reframe, and reflect on public theology in the first part of our symposium today. Dr. Storrar, I will say more in a moment, but welcome to you also. It is so appropriate that we are meeting today on April the 9th. For most of us in this time zone, it is the anniversary of the day that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging at Flossenburg concentration camp. Those of you that who are Bonhoeffer scholars will no doubt have picked up the allusion to Bonhoeffer's 1942 Christmas letter after 10 years. Bonhoeffer says, "We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have been drenched by many storms. We have learnt the arts of equivocation and pretense. Experience has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. intolerable conflicts have worn us down and even made us cynical. Are we still of any use? In these turbulent times, which many of us are describing as almost a quadruple pandemic, at least for us here in the US, of COVID-19, racialized violence, the silent pandemic of poverty in our society, and the effects of the bifurcation of the public sphere in our latest election season and the administration preceding it, we think it is more than an appropriate time for those of us in the faith communities to ask ourselves the question, how are we still of any use? Our panel today is going to begin to reflect on these issues with us. Any member of our panel could engage us for 2 hours on the topic, but we are delighted to have a panel of Dr. Victoria Barnett, who has been called the world's foremost Bonhoeffer scholar, Rabbi Nancy Kreimer, whose global work on interfaith engagement, especially amongst Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders, has been transformative, and 2 of our seminary graduates, Dr. Charles Howard, whose work and witness in the Black Lives Matter movement and on issues of poverty speak directly to us in these turbulent times, and the Reverend Dr. Leah Shade, whose deliberative dialogue attends to particular public issues around which we have seen in this political bifurcation, including the election and the climate crisis. It's also significant that we are meeting on April the 9th as we honour the Reverend Dr. Katie Day. And for those of you that do not know Dr. Day, I'm going to say a few brief words. Dr. Day has been a beloved faculty member at first the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, now the United Lutheran Seminary, which has campuses in Gettysburg and Philadelphia and a large distance learning community. As you can see, she began at LTSP in 1985 with all the delightful faculty fashions there. Dr. Day is the person on the lower right hand in this photo, and she has recently retired. When Dr. Day retired, she said that she did not want a retirement party that was focused on her, but instead a public theology forum that would bring people together, and that was the best testament to her work. So this symposium today is the fruition of that request, which is so characteristic of her as a Presbyterian minister, professor, community organizer, and activist. Katie Day chose April the 9th as the date of her ordination, so she would constantly be kept honest and humble in her ministry and called to attend to the bigger issues. In the last 36 years, she has been one of the few sociologists working in seminaries in the US. She is a dynamic and rigorous teacher, a meticulous and attentive ethnographic researcher, a pioneer in engaged methods of pedagogy and theological education. And I know alumni in this meeting will aptly remember the final exam for Church and Society, which had an in viva team approach to it. She is a profound preacher, and many of us recall the annual service here that commemorates Kristallnacht with broken glass all over the altar on the Philadelphia campus chapel. And she is a treasured colleague and friend. Through Dr. Day, our seminary became one of the founding members of the Global Network for Public Theology, and I commend to you her work with Sebastian Kim in the Brill Companion on Public Theology. Dr. Day will respond after the keynote and after the panel, and I hope that we will have time for questions following. Dr. Storrar, the director of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, and in many ways the founding member of the Global Network for Public Theology, when asked whether he would do the keynote address for a public theology symposium honouring Katie Day, he said he would be delighted to do so. Katie is family, he declared. And I know Elaine Graham and Sebastian Kim and other family members are in the room. So in the spirit of this family that points towards theology in the public sphere and not to themselves, I am going to introduce Dr. Storrar by a quote of his, rather than read you elements of his impressive bio, some parts of which are on the screen and you can read for yourself. This quote I use whenever I am teaching public theology, and I think it expresses well this symposium. A truly public theology operates in the public sphere. Today, the public sphere is global, torn, and divided. Public theology should help to create a more inclusive public sphere in which the public anger of the silenced and excluded voices of the oppressed and marginalized can be heard and addressed. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Storrar today to present to us on public theology and to honour his friend and colleague, Dr. Katie Day. Dr. Storrar, it is over to you.
Thank you, Storm, for your kind introduction. It is truly a delight to give this keynote presentation in honor of our esteemed colleague and beloved friend, Dr. Katie Day. At Katie's prompting, as we've heard, our theme is the challenge of public theology in turbulent times, asking Bonhoeffer's haunting question in an earlier era of ecclesial equivocation at evil. Are we still of any use? Before turning to our reformulation of Bonhoeffer's question for our symposium, how are we still of any use? Let us start by asking a more basic question. And our question is, what is public theology? It is a term that is in increasing use across the academy and in the churches around the world. That is a good thing. No one has copyright on the term, but the term is in danger of losing its usefulness if confused with other ways of doing theology. I believe something important is lost. In particular, public theology is not a synonym for political theology. They are not the same thing, in my view. Political theology is a living history of religious thought on politics in the Abrahamic traditions, which is thousands of years old, reflecting on the political ordering of state and society in the classic and current texts of these traditions. To think only of those around me here in Princeton, consider Eric Gregory on Augustine and citizenship in the Christian tradition, or Michael Walzer on politics and the Hebrew Bible. This is political theology. It is true that public theology also draws on such texts and thinkers and is similarly concerned with political questions. But public theology engages them in its own way by going public. As Katie Day says, public theology is performative. And so allow me to offer a working definition of public theology for discussion in our symposium. One of many, but one I think that Katie Day and I would share. We do theology as a performative activity in the public sphere, when we engage public issues for the public good. Here I draw on Jürgen Habermas's understanding of the public sphere as existing whenever and wherever two or more people meet to discuss and act on issues of public concern, whether in a bar or in a pulpit, in a public gathering, in the public media, or on online discussion groups, in what are called the micro-publics of our pluralist and diverse societies, and in any form of cooperative action for the public good, not only as citizens, but as non-citizens. To echo a well-known biblical saying, wherever two or three are gathered on public issues, there is the public sphere in the midst of them. The public sphere is where opinion is formed and felt, not only in arguments about the public interest, but also in cries of lament at injustice. As Rebecca Chopp and Iris Marion Young have reminded us. In this country, from the days of slavery to the present cries of Black Lives Matter, the spirituals of the Black Church have voiced a performative theology of justice and hope in the public sphere like no other. What then does theology bring to that public conversation? There are many valid ways in which diverse theologies speak in public. We must be inventive, not prescriptive. But for me, the theologian Elaine Graham gives us one helpful way to understand what we are doing when we go public in theology. In her seminal book on public theology, Giving Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Elaine says that we are doing nothing less than giving an account of the hope that is within us. We are giving a public account where we must be bilingual, translating our biblical hope into common languages and common actions for the common good. And so, with this understanding of public theology, as giving a public account of the biblical hope within us and performing it for the public good, let us return to Bonhoeffer's question. How are we still of any use? In these turbulent times of inequality in education and employment, in wealth and well-being, all exposed and exacerbated around the world by COVID-19. As a visual thinker, inspired by the work of Katie Day, let me offer you three images of how we may be of any use today. This is a digital image of doing public theology in turbulent times. Look carefully at the figure kneeling on the ground at the bottom right-hand corner of the picture. Who is he? Why is he kneeling there with his ear to the ground? What is he listening for? What is the occasion? This digital image is called Stampede. It is by the Cuban artist Jorge Otero Escobar. The figure kneeling in Times Square in Manhattan is a Cuban peasant. He has his ear to the ground in a traditional farming practice of listening to the reverberations of unsettled livestock or approaching storms. And what is the occasion that prompted Escobar to conceive and create this extraordinary digital work? The date gives us the clue. It was done in 2014 when an American administration was opening up trade links with Cuba after decades of embargo. Whatever the benefits of such a change in American foreign policy, Escobar feared it would mean a stampede of foreign interests that would overwhelm Cuban life. And so he came to Times Square and put his ear to the ground to listen out for the gathering storm of commercial interests threatening his island community and its way of life. This is my first image of doing public theology in turbulent times, kneeling attentively with our ear to the ground, listening for the global forces at work in local places, and making sense of their significance in local lives. Here I think the methods of doing public theology are closest to those of anthropology, seen in the work of scholars like Didier Fassin, an anthropologist here in Princeton. The following description of his discipline could equally describe what we are doing when we do public theology. Anthropology is a discipline that deals with wider theoretical issues in the context of local conditions, large issues explored in small places. Isn't that a perfect description of what the preacher as public theologian does? Addressing large issues in the small places of the pulpit and sanctuary, the congregation and community. We are still of any use in public theology if we have our ear to the ground. Where we see public theology being performed brilliantly in this way, with ear to the ground in small places, is of course in Katie Day's work as sociologist and theologian of church and society. Katie Day's study of faith communities in Philadelphia is a classic on urban religion, raising large theoretical issues in the small places on Germantown Avenue, between the Presbyterian Church in Chestnut Hill and the Al-Aqsa Islamic Center. Faith on the Avenue is also a classic on how we do public theology. The insights of Katie's spatial approach and inductive method have been expanded in scope and range of contributors in Katie's latest publication, her co-edited Handbook of Religion and Cities. In that book, Katie captures the challenge of doing public theology with ear to the ground. She writes about researchers in the field, but equally she could be describing public theologians. She writes, the researcher participates in the life of the community, which might mean attending worship, working in social services programs, going to meetings, hanging out in the community and patronizing its businesses, sharing meals, going to fairs and festivals, and having many conversations throughout in both formal and informal ways. The goal is to understand the experience of people within their context, to see the world through their eyes. Public theology as sharing meals. I like that. That brings me to my second image of how we are still of any use. This is a block print of an intriguing figure, seen from the back, with a halo round their head and a fork in their pocket. Who can this be, and what can it all mean? The print is called The Neighborhood Saint. The title is taken from a poem of the same name. The Neighborhood Saint. He carries a fork in his back pocket because he knows all God's children got knives. I love the poet and the artist's joke of the neighborhood saint as the ordinary person who is always ready to whip out the fork in their back pocket and invite their hostile neighbor with dagger drawn to sit down face to face and enjoy a meal together, turning their knife and fork into instruments of peace. It is a necessary but not sufficient thing to have our ear to the ground in doing public theology, exploring large public issues in small local places. We must also be willing to meet in person with our neighbors, face to face in long-term relationship building for the common good. This is the profound insight of the broad-based organizing movement in the United States. Going back to the pioneering work of Saul Alinsky in Chicago in the 1930s and forward to the enduring work of the Industrial Areas Foundation in cities like New York and Baltimore today. As one of the IAF's national leaders, Michael Geekin, has said, we need to create what he calls a relational culture to challenge the power of the dominant cultures of the market and bureaucracy operating at every level from the state to the landlord. As Mike writes in his book on organizing Going Public, the dynamic of the relational culture is created by the leaders who initiate and deepen and multiply effective public relationships. They see themselves as recruiters, talent scouts, and trainers. They look for other leaders, not passive followers or adoring dependents. Their bottom line is not profit or loss or clients served, but expanding pools of reciprocity and trust among people who can act with purpose and power. Doing public theology is about expanding those pools of trust. We are still of any use if we do so face to face. But where do we find this kind of public theology being done face to face in building a relational culture of trust, leading to those neighborhood saints acting with power for the public good? Once again, we see this face-to-face approach to doing public theology in the work of Katie Day. We see it in her own writing on faith-based organizing, as in her chapter in this volume, Yours the Power, which Katie and I edited together. We also see it in her teaching and in her students, especially those who've gone on to be pastors and preachers. I was a parish minister for 10 years before I began to teach practical theology at university. I know what it is like to be in the pulpit, face to face with the same people Sunday by Sunday, preaching on those raw topics where you know your congregation is deeply divided. That is why this book by one of our panelists and Katie's students is so remarkable. A visionary example of how to do public theology from the pulpit, face to face in that purple zone, where alone hearts and minds are changed for the public good, whether on gun violence or any of the fraught issues of the day. We are still of any use if we have the courage to be face to face with those with whom we disagree on seemingly intractable problems, and yet work to find common ground for the common good. Okay, you may well be thinking by now, ear to the ground, face to face, we get it. But where is the theology in all of this small-scale ethnography of large issues and broad-based organizing around public relationships? Your question is perfectly timed as we come to my third and final image. This is an altarpiece. It is in a modern Lutheran church in one of the remotest places on the planet, the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic, between my native Scotland and Iceland. It is called in Faroese simply the Christians' Church, Christianskirken, in the Faroes. The painted altarpiece is extraordinary, stretching from the brick-built communion table to the arched roof in the shape of the hull of a ship in these seafaring islands. The mural depicts a parable from the Gospels, the parable of the great dinner in Luke's Gospel, chapter 14. It is a parable of the kingdom of God, spurred in Luke by someone trying to book his seat in advance at the table in the kingdom of God. To counter that presumption, Jesus tells the story of the host at a great dinner, who sends out invitations to his friends. One by one, they give their excuses. I've just bought 5 head of oxen. I've just got married. The host is angry and tells his servants, go out into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Then, when he is told there is still room at the table, the host tells his servants to go out onto the public highway and urge passing strangers to join him for dinner. Set above the Lord's table in the sanctuary, the painting of the parable is clearly intended to say who is invited to the Eucharist, not the entitled, but the maimed on the margins and the stranger on the road. Indeed, we might rename this story the parable of the company of strangers, after the writer Parker Palmer's apt phrase for public life, the company of strangers. This Lutheran altarpiece beautifully portrays a company of strangers walking slowly in public to the Lord's table to enjoy the feast in the kingdom of God. This, says Jesus, is what God's kingdom is like. But it is the Japanese theologian Kosuke Koyami who sees the theological significance of this slow walk to God's table. In his Asian theology of the 3-mile-an-hour God, Koyama writes, love has its speed. It is a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we notice or not, at 3 miles an hour. It is the speed we walk, and therefore the speed the love of God walks. This parable shows how we can only do public theology at walking speed. Why? Because it turns out the love of God walks at the speed required for immersion in small places. We are still of any use if we are on foot, walking in the company of strangers towards the public feast, building relationships of purpose and power. Those of us who founded the global network of public theology, and I'm thrilled that so many, Katie, are in the room with us today, Schieren Sebastian, Elaine Graham, Rudolf von Sinner, and many others. Those of us who founded the Global Network for Public Theology look to the United Lutheran Seminary as one of the world's great stages for the performance of public theology. Ear to the ground, face to face, on foot, like Katie Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. That was powerful. As always, you were compelling and clear and creative and more than gracious. So thank you so much for that. And you remind us that public theology is engaged theology, ear to the ground, face to face, in conversation, not in abstract. And on foot, it is radically incarnational. Doing theology is active and interactive. It is indeed performative, but it's what we do, not just what we read or write or think or believe, but it is about listening and dialogue and being there, but also where we put our bodies. Mm. For Bonhoeffer, he often said that we should be doing theology and be church in the concrete, one of his favorite words. it's funny because even before, for those of you who are not so familiar with public theology, I'm sure you are familiar with public theologians. Those people who not only think and write theologically, but whose actions cannot be separated from their theology, that they are of the same piece. So we think of Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, Desmond Tutu, Byers Nagier, Abraham Heschel, Reverend William Barber today, and so many others, including those gathered here and especially on this panel, for whom their theology is being constructed even in the process of their engagement, and that engagement is informed by their theology. So it is an ongoing process. The focus on public theology is in response to centuries of very individualistic theologies, which focused on individual souls and spirituality. But the focus here is on publics, those individuals who are part of not one monolithic public, but publics, multiple publics. So this means that as public theologians, we need to be conversant and in dialogue with many publics, that is separate social spaces, to be able to learn the new languages, as you were talking about, to learn accessible languages. So as Elaine talks about being bilingual, but even multilinguality, we can't just stay with our little theological vocabulary anymore. So, for example, to focus on gun violence prevention or the issue of guns, we need to be able to engage a number of publics, including the worlds of gun owners and gun victims, the worlds of gun sellers and first responders. We also need to be drawing on and in dialogue with multiple disciplines, including law and economics and law enforcement and public health. So doing public theology is multidimensional, it's dynamic, it's complicated, and it can be messy. But it is this is the messiness, the complexity to which we are called in order to understand and have a credible presence as a community of faith. Obviously, the complexity of this construction of public theology means that it is not just the job of one brilliant theologian, but it is very much of a team effort. So I have a question for you, Will, and that is, in this process of doing public theology in all the ways that we have discussed, we're really drilling down into particular local contexts. So the public issues and the public theology, theological engagement for those in Hong Kong and Myanmar are different than those in South Africa or Germany or the First Nations or neighborhoods in Boston. So for all of the emphasis on the particularity and particularly that neighborhood saint, public theology must also recognize relationships and dynamics between local and global, between the particular and the global dynamics. Can you say more about that?
Thank you, Katie. Yes, I think what the pandemic has done is shown that this great god of our age, globalization, under whose banner, in a way, we founded the Global Network for Public Theology, is actually the emperor with no clothes. In other words, one tiny virus in one very local part of the world immediately shut down all the physical and mobile links of globalization within weeks. The planet itself in climate change is showing us that the pretensions of humanity to be masters of the universe, the global giant, is also a pretension and a dangerous illusion. So we have all been through the experience around the world in every place, sobered by this experience and brought back to the local. When we founded the Global Network for Public Theology, I used the term that we should think of the global as the glocal. It's an ugly word from the social sciences, but it meant that global forces adapt to local contexts. And it was one way of thinking about this relationship between the global and the local. It gave priority to the global, these global forces, but recognized they worked out differently in each local context, the glocal. But I think for me, and I shared this little word, I've begun to use another word in my own thinking to describe how we should think about the global now. If we knock the big letter G of global, we get a lovely, more mellifluous sounding word, the lobal. And I think I'm using this word to describe the way in which in all our localities, which is the only place that we exist, no human being, not even Bill Gates, lives at the global level. We're all in particular places at particular times, as Zoom has reminded us with trying to work out everyone in different time zones. We are not omniscient and omnipresent like the deity. But we do, like that Cuban peasant kneeling to the ground in Times Square, we do in our localities around the world, we do hear these global forces, what Robert Schreiter wonderfully in his book on Between the Local and the Global called the global flows, whether it's the pandemic and COVID-19 or trade or ideas or whatever. So I think we need a new confidence in the local as the only place of the global, and yet to connect all these global places where we hear the global forces together. So that's how I would reframe it from the local to the global. I think we do need to really deflate the notion of globalization, affirm the importance of the local as the place where the global happens. And therefore, we need networks like the GNPT, the Global Network for Public Theology, to connect these local conversations, to understand how these global forces are working differently, but in connected ways around the world, and then form networks of organizing and power and relationship to challenge where they're oppressive and destructive of humanity and the planet.
Well, I wish to thank you both for just a really engaging start to this symposium, and not just the words, but the images that we are taking from this. And we are going to move into looking at inviting our panel to talk. Each panelist has been asked to speak initially for about 8 minutes about the challenge of public theology in turbulent times. How are we still of any use? That question that alludes to Bonhoeffer's paper after 10 years. And we are going to begin with Dr. Victoria Barnett. Dr. Barnett is former director of programs on ethics, religion, and Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and editor, I think, of the Bonhoeffer canon, and of this recent work, editor and author of the Introduction to the Republication of After 10 Years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Our Times. Although you say we must be cautious about drawing simplistic historical analogies, I'm hoping that you will locate the main question about how reflecting historically upon Bonhoeffer at this time can help us in our ethical responsibilities as citizens as we face the particular challenges in our time.
Well, thank you so much. It is really a pleasure and honor to be part of the symposium honoring the work of my good friend and colleague, Katie Day, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm very grateful for the introductions that we just heard. And it's very moving and appropriate that our conversation is taking place not only in the week of the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, the victims of the Holocaust, but also on this date, the day of the execution of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So this question of analogy is a good place to begin. My impatience with the analogies comes with what I sometimes see as a rush to draw parallels to Nazi Germany, and my conviction that in this country and in our particular national moment, our problem is not the result of German history, but very much the outcome of American history. And it is there where we need to turn our focus, going way back to the genocide of the indigenous peoples of this continent, the enslavement of Africans, and the multifaceted economic, political, social, and cultural legacies with which we still wrestle. The combination today of white supremacy and all kinds of forms of hatred targeting different groups, our extreme economic inequality, political and public corruption, and the uniquely horrific levels of violence in our society, including gun violence, that really do set us apart from most societies in this world. At the same time, we also have remarkable examples of public theology and prophetic witness from many leaders in our society, social justice movements, and leaders who in crucial moments offer the way forward, as did Bonhoeffer in his own time. But in this particular moment where we are so divided and very much a wounded country, I think it is useful to reflect on what we can learn from the history of Nazi Germany, and in particular, what Bonhoeffer has to say to us today. In 1933, the German Evangelical Church, the church that came out of the Reformation, the church to which Bonhoeffer and 2/3 of the German population belonged, which was arguably the most important and powerful institution in Germany. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, this institution was immediately torn apart by a phenomenon of a right-wing theologically and ideologically driven attempt to align this powerful church with the new Nazi state. It was spearheaded by a group called the German Christian Faith Movement, which had developed out of the various movements during the 1920s, and which held a nationalistic, ethnocentric vision of what the church should be, that it should be a Germanic church that reflected the culture and manners of the Germanic tradition and history, that it should be an Aryan church, aligning itself with Nazi ideology. And with Hitler's support, this group sought the Nazification of German Protestantism. By the fall of 1933, they held influential positions across Germany in all of the different regional Protestant churches, including control of most of the theological seminaries and oversight of the ordination and training of clergy. The German Christians sought an Aryan church that would align itself with the Nazi state, and they began to revise Christian theology and teachings along those lines, proclaiming Jesus to be an Aryan figure, getting rid of all references to Jesus' Jewishness, and removing the Old Testament from the Bible. This led to a strong backlash within Protestantism, and it led eventually to the formation of the Confessing Church, which was strongly critical of the German Christians and dedicated itself to this fight against the Nazification of Protestantism. Bonhoeffer, within this movement, within the movement of the Confessing Church, was a somewhat singular voice because he was one of the few people who, as early as 1933, was really calling with a clean break with the German Christians. He argued that it was impossible for true confessional Christians to be in the same institution with a group like the German Christians. But while the Confessing Church certainly had the potential to be a major change within Protestantism, and the potential to become more politically in opposition to National Socialism itself. And I must say there was a tiny minority in the confessing church that did eventually go there. But most Protestant leaders, including most confessing church leaders, simply had two goals during the 1930s. One, they wanted to prevent a schism. They wanted at all costs to keep the German evangelical church together. And two, they didn't want the Nazi state to take over the church. And the fear of a schism was partly related to that. And this group won. There was never a schism in the German evangelical church. The German Christians and the confessing church and everybody in between stayed within the same institution. The church never fell apart. And the Nazi state really didn't need to take control of the confessing church, because what ensued was a steady move toward compromise and conformity at all points of the spectrum. The state stepped in only when people crossed the political lines. That didn't happen very often. The confessing Christians and the German Christians continued to battle it out. People shifted along the way from one side to the other. There were Nazi party members in the confessing church, and there were certainly people who were deeply anti-Semitic. So the lines of this internal church struggle, which went from 1933 well into 1938, were always fuzzy and with lots of moving parts. And that meant that by 1938, the confessing church, the church of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller, was really a shell of what it might have been. It essentially disintegrated. There were still confessing congregations, but it did not live up to its early promise. And in 1938, the church lawyer Gustav Heinemann, who later became a prominent politician after 1945, but in 1938, he was a member of the governing council of the confessing church, and he publicly resigned, and giving an impassioned, moving speech in which, among other things, he said, "How much have we declared unbearable, and yet we bear it?" That's what happened, not just in the church, it happened across German society. In every walk of life, in the universities, in the judiciary, in the civil service, in the Prussian military elites with which Dietrich Bonhoeffer in a few years would find himself in the resistance, each one of these sectors of German society eventually caved step by step with the Nazi state and failed to truly oppose it. Nazi Germany is a case study in this gradual step-by-step process of complicity in systemic evil by which most people conform, make compromises, continue their careers, and try to stay out of trouble, only to realize at some point that they have lost their way, and along that way they have lost their souls. And so Bonhoeffer himself made some compromises along the way. His legacy to us today is not that he was perfect, but that he was honest, and he came to the point. We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have become cunning and learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Experience has rendered us suspicious of human beings, and often we have failed to speak a true and open word. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down and even made us cynical. Are we still of any use? It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned what it means to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. This point, I would say, is the connection between Bonhoeffer's time and our own. On this anniversary of Bonhoeffer's death, in these weeks where we are reliving the awful murder of George Floyd, with thousands of refugee children in tents near our borders, and families that have been wrenched apart, and people who are hurting for all kinds of reasons, Bonhoeffer's words, I think, are a very good starting point for this discussion and reflection on the meaning of public theology. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. And there is so much that you have opened up for us, and but we look forward to continuing the conversation a little later. Wish to invite Dr. Howard, whom we know as Chaz, and Dr. Howard, you know, as we commemorate Bonhoeffer today and remember his friendship with Frank Fisher and his time worshipping, teaching Sunday school, engaging in community, and hearing about the Black Christ preached at Abyssinian Baptist Church. I'm wondering if you, as author of Black Theology as Mass Movement, can speak to the challenges of these turbulent times and how the Black Lives Matter movement and actions of wider faith communities speak to us as we can be of use against the pandemic of racialized violence and the legacy of slavery and the current wave of white supremacy. And I acknowledge, as I invite all the speakers to speak, that we've invited them to speak on the topic, but also to speak about working with Katie Day, which we will attend to in a little time. But there may be an interweaving of both of these things as we go. But Dr. Howard, welcome again.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here with you all and see so many familiar faces whom I love, and some who I studied with and some who I studied under. Yeah, I know we'll have time later, but I have to say hello to my professor, Dr. Day. I'll say more later, but I wouldn't be here without you. I mean that in a few different ways. And then just every comment that's been said thus far has been so rich and such a blessing. There's so much swirling around in the air today, be it the trial and the pain that so many of us feel reliving the killing of George Floyd, or the death of Prince Philip over in England, and the really complicated emotions a lot of us feel around that. Or remembering the Holocaust and the courage of individuals like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Or I just saw that recording artist DMX passed away this afternoon too, a rapper. And I invoke him lastly because one of my great memories of my time at Lutheran was TAing for Professor Day. And some of that was running downstairs to get the tech people to come up and help us with technology stuff. But part of that was also learning from the best. And Professor Day would give me one session a semester to talk about theology and hip hop. And among the artists whom we would play in that class was the rapper DMX, rough cat who grew up not very far from the churches that Dietrich Bonhoeffer visited while teaching at Union. And DMX himself, so many ways, captures this intersection of hip hop and faith, and doing both of those things in a public space to impact others. So all of that is very close to me today. Your question about can we be of any use in the struggle for Black lives? Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I've held and wrestled with for the last 5 or 6 years. We've sort of we're in the midst of the second wave of Black Lives Matter. This first wave back after the killing of Trayvon Martin and some of those early names back then, and now the second wave after the uprisings over last summer, and the different ways that the church and corporate America and politicians have joined this wave for bringing about change. The way that it hits me the most is this question that was first posed to me from my professor, Professor Day, about thinking about the different publics of public theology. And if we are to sort of bring this question, to bring this challenge around Black Lives Matter to the public, we must think about different publics. And so for me, it's in a couple different ways. The first is this public of the church or faith communities. Not being a pastor or a rector myself, I get invited from time to time to fill in for folks when they go on vacation. I get a whole lot of week after Christmas invitations to preach, to kind of sub in for folks when they need vacation. And it's been this opportunity to engage church folks and people of faith broadly around Black Lives Matter. And we can come in with, a staple sermon, and come in with something to kind of, I don't know, just keep it moving. Or, hey, here's an opportunity to have a hard conversation. Again, it's one of the gifts of not being the pastor there. I can go in and throw a theological grenade and run. I don't have to worry about people voting with their feet, and I can leave the pastor to clean it up after I preach a hard sermon. So having these conversations with the church public about Black theology and Black Lives Matter. So when I was at Lutheran, I would leave Dr. Day's class and go to Stephen Ray's class, Brother Quinton's predecessor there. And one of the way that Stephen Ray would define Black theology, and I think he's extended this definition to Black Lives Matter broadly, is not just doing theology from a Black space with Black sources and goals for Black community, but it's ultimately reconstructing the center. And so bringing this to the conversations in churches, holding questions like, look at all the music that we've been singing in this space. Does any of it reflect the African diaspora? Let's look at all of the topics we've talked about in your coffee hour. Did it once ever speak about Black history or Juneteenth? Or are you mentioning any other Black names besides Martin Luther King Jr. every year? How about the guest preachers you're bringing in? How about the topics that you're preaching about? How about the prayers of the people, sort of reconstructing the center from a Eurocentric, white American-centric space to bringing in the Black experience and now more and more the brown experience and the experience of those of us on the bottom and others. This is sort of Black theology. This, to me, is doing Black Lives Matter in the public of the church. It's having these hard conversations, thinking about it and employing it, but that's just one public, my professor would tell me. The second is the public of the academy. I don't think I really saw myself as a future in administration. I always wanted to teach and preach, and I like to have a little room in my life to write and go to my kids' soccer games and stuff. But I blinked and I've been sucked into meetings with other folks, and so I'm serving now in this kind of vice presidential role at Penn. And it's an interesting opportunity to employ the vision of Black Lives Matter, the spirit of Black theology, with the scaffolding of public theology in an academic space. And so it's this interesting nuance. I mean, I think when I think of academic application of public theology, I think about writing in a way that pushes our field, that's accessible to different publics, but that's pushing our field and teaching this. But there's other aspects of the academy besides the work that we do in classrooms. Some of it is the administrative kind of stuff. And so it comes into like the searches we're doing for vacancies, making sure we have diverse pools. It's the curriculum work that we're doing. It's working on retention and recruitment and the impact of this big old 800-pound gorilla in West Philadelphia, making sure that we're being good citizens and not just kind of pushing our way around. It's asking questions of what does it mean to be an affluent institution in the poorest major city in America? This to me is public theology in an academic space, let alone in those opportunities where I get a chance to teach. It's looking at my syllabus. Yeah. I know it's not time to sort of celebrate Professor Day, but I remember sort of sitting with her and helping her and her working with me in crafting a syllabus, and the kind of gentle question of, not a whole lot of women on this bibliography here, Chaz. It said in love, not beat me up about it, but in a convicting sort of reconstructing my sort of male-centric syllabus in a way. It's trying to do the same thing with sort of people of color on the syllabus too, let alone what we're actually going to talk about when we meet. And bringing in Black voices besides, no offense, other theologians on here, besides just James Cone. There's so many other names we got to add to the list, y'all. And then the third public, finally, is sort of society out there. trying to make it not an out there, but making this all kind of continuous, global. I love what you were saying, Brother Will, earlier. Over the last couple summers, I've found myself at a number of demonstrations here in Philly and down in DC. A couple years back, I was invited with Reverend Barber and locally here, Shane Claiborne, some other cats, and we were sort of marching, and several issues were intersecting around Black Lives Matter and children being in cages and draconian, cruel immigration policies and sort of a heartlessness around gun violence and just so many cruel things. And so invited to hit DC a couple different times. And then having this moment where we're in this circle preparing to march to the White House across the little park there, and having the mic passed to me finally. And thinking about how can we teach theology in the 3 minutes allotted to me here, outside the walls of our seminary, without a grade being given out at the end of this. How can I share what I've been reading for all these years and what I've been praying about for all these years with students who I don't know before we go and get arrested? How can we speak and teach Black Lives Matter in 3 minutes to protesters? That's the challenge I think I and so many people around the country have been wrestling with. Not just firing people up to go out there and teaching them a couple of chants, but doing theological God talk work in a few minutes of saying why we believe God is with us and why we think God does not like what this country, institution, city, police force are doing right now. And here's why, and here's what we think God would want us to do. If that's not public theology, I'm not sure what it is. Engaging these different publics and going out incarnationally to bring about change. Thanks.
Thank you so much. As an Episcopalian, I'm always glad to end on that incarnational note. But again, thank you for the images and passion and so much that we can come back to. We're going to move now to invite Rabbi Nancy Kreimer to speak. And let me just... I was looking at sharing your bio, Rabbi Kreimer, and it's eluding me at the moment. So I will bring it up and speak to it. Or not. I will bring it up alongside in a moment. Rabbi Nancy Fuchs-Kremer is a dear colleague of Dr. Day's from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And Rabbi Kreimer, as we think, in having the background, the realities of Bonhoeffer's Jewish family members through marriage who are Jewish, and we go beyond his preaching and teaching to the ethical responsibility that he came to feel, not only to use his church connections during the war to communicate with the Allies about German surrender, but to work with the Abwehr to get Jewish persons out of Germany, even as the Shoah was unfolding, but also to take upon himself the ultimate action of not only helping victims who have fallen under the wheel, but to fall into the spokes of the wheel himself, through engaging with others what he saw as the sin of tyrannicide, the plot to kill Hitler. As a founding member of the Interfaith Center of Philadelphia and co-author of Strangers, Neighbors, Friends, Muslim, Christian, Jewish reflections on compassion and peace. Can you speak to us from your own location about interfaith partnerships in public theology, and how that may enable us to be of more use than acting in religious silos, particularly at this time, I think, where there is a significant challenge to interfaith empathy. So, Rabbi Kreimer, we welcome you to this.
Okay, so thank you. It's really a pleasure. Am I speaking now? This is okay. Can you put me on so that people can see? Yes. Okay, great. I'm not sure I'm covered. I'm not sure that I'm coming up, but because I had to, yeah. Yes, I am. Okay, wonderful. What an honor to be here today, and what an honor to speak right after Chaz, on a little bit of a humbling honor. Yes, Katie Day and I had the great pleasure and privilege of teaching together religious leadership, the co-formation of rabbinical students and Lutheran seminarians for a number of years. And I learned so much from Katie that it was very hard for me not to write this short talk without constantly referring back to what I learned from Katie. So apologies. I know that wasn't what I was supposed to do, but it's what I ended up doing. So in this moment of white nationalism rising with anti-Semitism as part of that toxic mix of isms, I could use my allotted time to talk to you all, mostly non-Jews, I believe, about Jewish vulnerability and about the need for interfaith in this time of more awareness of Christian hegemony, and the need for empathy for Jews. And I am so appreciative of that as being part of Katie's legacy, that she went to the trouble of being trained as a Holocaust educator, and that she insisted on the observance of Kristallnacht at her seminary. And I see one of my colleagues, Rabbi Liz Bolton, is here, who led services with Katie. So it's really quite lovely. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about public theology and the growing edges for my own community, because I can't think of a better tribute to my friend and colleague Katie than self-scrutiny. That feels like her Torah, as we call it, her teaching. And as we try to raise large issues in small spaces, as I learned just an hour ago is the key to all of this, I found that there were three themes that I actually learned from Katie that I want to really just highlight briefly. The three themes are place, disruption, and empathy. First, we'll start with place. The power of place. Okay, I went to rabbinical school in North Philadelphia, 6 blocks from Temple University, where our class could be delayed because we found a sleeping homeless man on the steps and classmates were taking him to a shelter. In 1982, 2 weeks after I was ordained, the moving vans pulled up and my rabbinical school moved to leafy Elkins Park, not far from Old York Road, a street lined with large synagogue buildings that had preceded us in the move, along with their Jewish congregations in the 1950s. You can't know Katie Day long without knowing how much place matters to her, how deeply she loves Germantown Avenue, how often she would tell her students, you're not becoming ministers just any place, you're becoming ministers here. And that was a lesson that I had to constantly absorb as I tried to then become a professor in this new location. I have tried to be a good disciple of Katie's in this teaching. So in 9/11, 2001, we all, well, at least some of us, opened eyes that had been pretty blind to the question of Islam. And we began reading all these books about this exotic faith all over the world. But what I knew was that we didn't really need to know so much about Muslims. Of course, we needed to know about Muslims in the world, but we needed to know about Muslims in America. And we needed not just to know about Muslims in America, we needed to know about Muslims in Philadelphia. Because of Katie's modeling, I started taking my rabbinical students to meet their neighbors. Masjidullah, many of you know that if you've been in Philadelphia, became our go-to place to learn about the history of African American Islam through the eyes of elders who had lived it right there, 4 miles from our rabbinical school. You could walk, right? I can walk there. When Islamophobic ads started to appear on SEPTA buses, it was showing up at Masjidullah that really made the most meaning for me. I signed the petitions, I went to the big demonstrations, I wrote op-eds, but it was having relationships. It was building relationships. And what I taught my students, and what makes me so happy when they report back, is that when they move to a new place, they don't wait until there's the first Islamophobic crisis to call up the mosque and say, "Where are you? Can we come and help?" You build the relationships first. Second point, disruption. I thank Linda Noonan for this in a chapter she wrote for Katie's latest book, and I had the good luck of already reading. And she gave me language for something that I have known for years, but I never articulated it this way, what it means to disrupt sacred space. Take back to 1979, the first wedding I ever performed. As we planned the ceremony, the young man and woman asked me if I wouldn't mind pausing at the part in the ceremony where I say, "By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania," and at that point to acknowledge the lack of rights of gay people to legally marry. At the time, there were very few people in my life whom I knew to be gay. This was 1979. None that I knew wanted to be married. The request sounded absurd to me. And it also sounded wrong to me to disrupt a beautiful, personal, holy moment with a little political advertisement. I am abashed to tell you that I did not do that what the couple wanted. I just thought it was too weird. Fast forward to the 2000s, when I rarely, if ever, performed a wedding without such a mention. And I would push couples to do it. If they didn't bring it up, I would say, "You know, I would like to say this before I start invoking the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that doesn't allow all people to marry." I will tell you that it actually became normative part of the wedding service in circles that I travel in until it was no longer needed. Baruch Hashem, thank God. I know it was the courage of many gay people who came out to their families and friends that shifted the culture and ultimately our laws. But I now understand, and especially having heard the first half of the symposium, how the disruption of public ritual, even small spaces like a wedding service, are part of a movement. Finally, empathy. I want to talk about empathy, an example of an emerging awareness for me and for some other Jews. And it's a seasonal example that relates to the Passover holiday. In the 1950s, I grew up singing "Let My People Go" at our family seders. It was actually in our Haggadah, which was published in 1941 by the Reconstructionist movement. But we were ahead of our times. By the 1960s, especially thanks to Paul Robeson's popular rendition, "Let My People Go, Go Down Moses," had become a staple of American Jewish families' celebration of Passover. I don't know if you all know this. Our traditional Passover songs were all in Hebrew, but we were not Hebrew speakers anymore. And we desperately needed a song that people could understand in English. And by the way, it was great music. So we were proud of our ancestors, that their story had inspired people centuries later in their fight for freedom. And we thought this was America at its most beautiful, the blending of cultures. Needless to say, with very few exceptions, we were all white people there at those tables. So in recent years, that's changed. There are now Black Jews. Well, there were Black Jews all along, but they were at different tables. We now know that they're there. And they have been joined by Black Jews through conversion, through intermarriage, through adoption, and many more ways. And some of them began to speak up about that tradition. And at first it was hard to listen because you had to listen not to what you thought was good, but what they were telling you felt like to them. So here's the tricky thing about empathy. So when Jews first hear that someone else's cultural product being used by you is not necessarily a compliment, Jews don't get it. They have suffered persecution by being victims, but not by being victims of economic exploitation in America. That's not part of the American Jewish story. The specific history of Black musicians and white Jews in the music business, that was new to us. Many Jews don't know very much about the problematic echoes of minstrelsy. White Jews belting out unattributed, a song first published by a Black man in 1851 is not neutral blending of culture. It doesn't feel benign to marginalized people as it does to the people feeling in the center, as white people do, as white Jews did. And we're learning this lesson from our indigenous tribal colleagues and now from our Black Jewish friends. So that's what I want to talk about: place, disruption, and empathy. And I want to close. Oh, time to move on. I'm done.
Oh, please close.
What? Can I close? It's a tiny little story. It's a little story that includes place, disruption, and empathy. So a few years ago, Katie taught a course at LTS, ULS, United Lutheran Seminary, on God and guns. And she invited a guest speaker whose son had been killed by gun violence. The speaker brought her young grandsons with her that evening. And I was there that evening, and they were playing in the hall. And later, Katie told me that when they left, she noticed that there was a painting in the hall of the death of Jesus with graphic detail. And in a moment of empathy and disruption and very local activism, Katie made a phone call, and that painting was taken down. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kreimer, and thank you for the vignette at the end that I think really does speak to that sense of interfaith empathy and the acute need for it at this time. I'm going to invite Dr. Leah Shade to speak. Dr. Shade, as we have the backdrop of thinking about Bonhoeffer and the emergence of that complex entity that was the confessing church, and the role of that faith community standing against Christian nationalism, Hitler, and failed to see and act to save Jewish sisters and brothers as children of God. As founder of the Clergy Emergency League in our time and author of Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry and the Red-Blue Divide, can you speak to what you see about the turbulent times here and whether and how we are still of any use in a time when Christian communities can seem fractured by political affiliation, both distanced and brought together by the digital response to the pandemic, but at times no closer to engaging the public issues that underlie political difference as a collective power for good? I invite Dr. Shade.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you indeed, and we can see your screen.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me just get this to play here. Hold on one second. There we go. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Swain and President Irwin, Dean Sebastian, ULS faculty, staff, and students for the opportunity to celebrate my mentor and friend, Dr. Katie Day. I was driving to my office today, and it just so happened that Phil Collins' song, Take Me Home, came on the radio. And that's the way it sort of felt, seeing all of you on screen. It's just wonderful to be back with all of you, even in this digital space. Dr. Day was my church and society professor when I was an MDiv student from 1996 to 2000 at what was then the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. When I returned to LTSP as a PhD student in 2009, I took her graduate seminar, Religion and Social Change, which guided the trajectory of my dissertation about preaching and creation care. It also inspired my own public theology and activism around social issues such as climate change, environmental justice, racism, LGBTQIA issues, white Christian nationalism, and the role of the church in a divided society. One of the most important things Dr. Day taught me was the value of social movement theory to help organize and study social change. The other thing I learned from her was the importance of conducting quantitative and qualitative research at the local, regional, and national level. I've applied these two key learnings in every aspect of my ministry, from preaching to teaching to research. Katie's influence can be seen in nearly every book I've written, in my Wabash grant studying pedagogies for civil discourse in the church and theological education, for which she was a consultant, and in my research in the areas of homiletics, religion, and environmental movement, and the church and politics. I especially drew on what I learned from her classes in my most recent work with the Clergy Emergency League. And I want to say a word about this organization because it connects directly to the symposium's focus on the work of Bonhoeffer and the question about whether we, clergy and congregations, are of any use in a society so traumatized by evil and broken by polarization and divisiveness. On June 1st, 2020, as protests and riots spread across the nation, with renewed outrage about racist violence, especially the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, President Donald Trump marched uninvited from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church with a military entourage for a photo holding a Bible. He was using Christianity to justify a version of law and order that is based on white supremacy. He co-opted religious symbols to claim an authority he did not have. Cloaked under the guise of Christianity, he was pushing this country to the brink of authoritarian dictatorship and martial law. So on my Eco-Preacher blog for Patheos, which is one forum for my public theology, I called for clergy to unite in a way similar to what the pastors in the confessing church did in Nazi Germany. With my co-founder, the Reverend Stephen Fearing, and a group of intrepid clergy colleagues who saw the necessity for forming this group, we launched the Clergy Emergency League in June of 2020. We now have 2,500 members on the Facebook group who engage with each other on how to resist white Christian nationalism, particularly as Christian clergy. We've released statements on violence in Portland, the 2020 election, the January 6th insurrection, and the Georgia voter suppression laws. We've hosted book studies, author interviews, lectionary text studies, and most recently, a panel discussion co-hosted with the Wisconsin Council of Churches about pastoring in the age of conspiracies and disinformation. And in our twice monthly member meetings, we listen to what pastors are facing when they engage social issues. This helps us strategize what might be most helpful for clergy given what is on the horizon in terms of political, social, and religious challenges. I want to make the case that this kind of support for the ministry of public theology is real, and it's making a difference. Whether it's preaching a bold sermon or standing alongside others, arms locked in protest, or providing water and rest for protesters, or taking on the work of addressing white supremacy and systemic racism, pastors are stepping up. Granted, resistance is complicated by the pandemic. Many of us have not been able to take to the streets in the ways that we normally would. But we are finding ways to connect, to share resources, to hold each other accountable for the justice work that needs to be done. to commiserate when we are attacked for exercising our prophetic voice, and to equip each other for the work to which we have been called. But don't just take my word for it. Let's look at the data, as Dr. Day has taught us to do. Drawing from a longitudinal study I conducted of mainline Protestant clergy in 2017 and 2021, the surveys indicate that overall, mainline Protestant clergy have shown an increased willingness to address social issues in their preaching when comparing 2017 and 2021. In the 17 survey, for example, respondents indicated that when it comes to the frequency of engaging social issues in their preaching, 77% said that they did so sometimes or frequently. But in the 2021 survey, that number rose to 95%, an 18% increase. So the data indicates that as a whole, mainline Protestant clergy are leaning heavily toward having their congregations and themselves engage social issues. But there are variables that complexify this picture. One of the most telling questions on the 2021 survey was whether preachers felt inhibited about addressing social issues in their pulpits. Overall, the majority of clergy, 62%, indicated that they have no problem engaging social issues and feel free to do so in their contexts. However, 35% said that they would like to engage social issues in their preaching, but they feel inhibited. Digging deeper, when we overlay factors such as gender, race, length of time in a congregation, the setting, whether it's rural or suburban or urban, to determine variables that correlate to pastors feeling more or less inhibited about social issues, we can see some really interesting things. For example, the data indicates that white female clergy, new to their churches, serving white congregations in rural areas, express an inhibition rate of 56%. But only 44% of males in that same category expressed feelings of inhibition. And male clergy serving congregations in cities or suburbs with at least 4 years at their church have only a 31% inhibition rate. Now, looking at the data in terms of race, male clergy of color were twice as likely to feel inhibited to address social issues than their female colleagues. This is regardless of the racial makeup of the congregation. But white clergy are twice as likely to feel inhibited than clergy of color. Thus, we can begin to think about how clergy in more vulnerable situations who do want to address social issues might be supported, equipped, and encouraged in this task given their unique challenges. Clergy needs support from denominational structures so that their positions are not in jeopardy when they choose to preach on social issues from a biblical and theological perspective. This must be an ongoing process in which clergy are accompanied by seminaries, denominational staff who have their backs, and fellow ministry colleagues who covenant to support each other in the task of addressing structural sin in their congregations and society. This is the work I've committed to in my ministry, preaching, activism, teaching, and research. And this is the work that Katie Day has done all throughout her ministry of teaching, activism, and research. This is what she's taught her students to do for decades. And this is what she continues to do as a professor emerita. In fact, if all goes according to plan, we will be co-presenting a paper for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in the fall entitled Preaching on Gun Issues, Clergy and Congregation Responses. I am so grateful to Katie for all she has taught and continues to teach me. She preached for my ordination service and has encouraged me in my career every step of the way. And as we were neighbors on Boyer Street for 2 years during my Ph.D. program, as her daughter babysat my children who are now themselves teenagers, as we have roomed together at SSR meetings, we've become not just colleagues, but friends. I'm humbled and honored to be able to celebrate this milestone of academic achievement with all of you. Are we still of any use? Thanks to the Reverend Dr. Katie Day, the unequivocal answer is yes. Thank you.
What a great lineup of speakers, and I just feel enormously grateful to all of you. We were hoping that we would have time for all of you to share something about what you've learned about public theology by working together with Katie Day, and many of you have done that as part of your presentations anyway. But, you know, this question about what would you hope the experience of the next generation of students and faculty to be as they engage issues of the day from a public theology perspective. I invite you to hold on to that question because I'm going to ask Dr. Day to respond to your presentations, and then we will together consider that, hopefully have time for some questions, and then finish off together. So Dr. Day, I invite you to the screen, and then we will come back to the panel to share some comments about public theology alongside you.
Am I on? So this is kind of wonderful and overwhelming. We opened our book, Sebastian Kim and I opened the introduction to the book, Handbook on Public Theology, with an anecdote from Ferguson. And there was, a huge response in Ferguson after the murder of Michael Brown. And there were clergy from many denominations who showed up, and a lot of the older clergy kind of expected that they would be the spokespeople. And there were chants through the crowd of show us what justice looks like, show us what justice looks like. And then when the old heads got up, the chant changed to show us what theology looks like. And so I feel like today has been a feast. I feel like we have been shown what theology looks like. And it is humbling and gratifying for me. I'm so grateful to ULS for doing this symposium. I spent 34 years of my career there. I never thought I would spend that long doing anything in my life, but the institution kept changing. And as I've said many times, I felt like I taught in 3 or 4 different schools. I'm looking at all of you. I'm grateful for my students over the years, especially those who challenged me, who expanded my ideas, sometimes called me out and had deep conversation. But I have to also say that, and I know a lot of the teachers out there feel the same way, that the deepest satisfaction that you get as a teacher is when you see your students surpass you in their skills, their passion, their wisdom, and their impact. And so I look to Chaz and Leah with such gratitude, and in fact, having far surpassed me, and I will root you on. I'm also grateful to my colleagues, especially those on the faculty. I see many of you on the screen as well. It's been an interesting journey that we've had as faculty. We've had our ups and downs as an institution. We have fought like siblings sometimes, but we've finally ended up loving and supporting each other. And I could not have asked for a better set of colleagues. And I especially want to express my gratitude to Storm Swain, who has pulled together this event, a monumental, a huge effort. and is a public theologian in her own right. So thank you, Storm, for all of your efforts. I'm grateful that I've had colleagues outside of the institution, scholars like Vicki Barnett and Nancy Kreimer, who have been conversation partners. And I have to say, and friends and collaborators and co-conspirators, that Vicki and Nancy are two of the most intellectually curious and creative women I know. And so you've made me a better person. I'm also grateful for collaborators, colleagues, friends from the Global Network for Public Theology. Certainly Will has been very important, and also Elaine Graham, who is out there. Thank you. And the colleagues from the American Academy of Religion and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion and Religious Research Association, Louisville Institute, the Center for the Study of Religion in Cities at Morgan State, and my colleagues in the gun violence prevention community. And we're having a moment now. We're having a celebration. Did I lose you?
You're still with us, Katie.
Okay, well, I can't see you, so I'll have to find you. And I'm grateful to the many communities who have welcomed me as a researcher over the years, from North Philadelphia to South Africa and many places in between, who have trusted me and opened up with their stories and telling their truths, which have deepened my understanding. As we look to the future of public theology, this has been a paradigm for ULS and LTSP since the early 2000s. And I'm heartened that even now there is a search process going on for an endowed position in public theology at the seminary. But we need to continue the focus on public theology. It is hard work, but it has never been more needed. In recent years, we've seen the assault on democracy, on reason, on social cohesion, as many of the speakers have talked about, in the US and around the world. Issues have become more complex than I've ever seen them in my career. You look at issues like immigration, climate crisis, public health. Clearly, these are global issues that need new collaborations. And then domestically, issues collide and intersect and fuel each other. So you can't really consider poverty and racism and gun violence and public education and mass incarceration and hunger and housing apart from one another. They are implicated with one another, and a good analysis has to incorporate that. So as a project, my hope for public theology going forward, I hope we've talked about a number of marks, and I would like to add a mark that I've seen here today and has been referenced today, and it goes back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who has been my companion throughout my vocation. I think of him starting off as a brilliant young but very academic theologian, to becoming a pastor and teacher, to his efforts at resistance, and finally his imprisonment and his execution. By the time he died at age 39, he had suffered a number of disappointments and disillusionments, and had really experienced real despair around what he saw his church becoming, what he saw his culture becoming, the confessing church that he had had so much hope for, the international church, none of which seemed to have a spine when it came to resisting Nazism. And yet, despite all of his disappointments and disillusionments, he continued to go on to find a way, and even at the end, held on to the capacity to love and to hope. And even in his last 2 years and last months, able to reimagine what the religious community might be, what the church might be. And so the mark that I hope will be a mark of public theology going forward is courage. And not courage in terms of heroicism, but courage to, first of all, tell the truth. Courage to tell the truth about ourselves, about our faith traditions, our institutions, about our privilege, our failings, our parochialism, where we're stuck and where we're deluding ourselves, where we are not living up to our stated values, or for Christians, following Jesus, whose name we dare to bear. So I think it takes courage to begin public theology with critical self-examination. Secondly, I think we need courage to be able to act, to be able to live out, to embody our theology, to put our bodies where our beliefs are, not unreflectively, and joining every march, signing every petition, giving money to every cause, but consciously grounding our action in deep communal reflection on why we are acting and how we are acting. And we will need courage to be displaced, courage to go into those communities and places where we might not feel comfortable, where we've never been, to have those conversations that we would rather not have. And I see and have heard so much of that courage from our panel today. And then finally, the courage, and Chaz, you really reminded me of this, the courage as public theologians to let go of ideas and structures that keep us from being faithful in the world. The courage to let go of familiar religious theological language when it inhibits rather than builds dialogue. Toward the end of his life, Bonhoeffer was imagining a religionless Christianity, which is only suggestive, but he wasn't able to develop the idea. But what would that look like? What is the courage we need to let go of the predictable ways of thinking and acting and being, so that we can think and act and be in creative new ways? So, President Irwin, the question is, can such courage be taught in seminary? Can it be packaged into a syllabus? Well, of course not, unless the seminary is not the only player. Public theology cannot be formed, cannot be located, cannot be cultivated only in theological schools. But we have to find new ways of partnering with other institutions and communities and organizations and traditions. We have to find new ways, fresh ways of forming public theologians, new partnerships, new pedagogies that make classroom walls porous and transcend the bubbles that we have created. My hope is that this seminar, which has been rich for me, has moved us an inch forward toward a courageous public theology. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Day. We are going to take maybe about 7 minutes for the panelists to be able to say something about what they've learned about public theology through working with Dr. Day, and what maybe just a few kind of bullet points about what would you hope to be the experience for the next generation of students and faculty as they engage issues of the day from a public theology perspective. And I invite you, as the panelists may be sharing, to add in the chat a comment or a word of gratitude or a memory of working with Dr. Day, so your voices can be present as well. If we were in person, this would be a much longer conversation, and we would have those delightful hallway conversations. But it is one of the painful paradoxes of the pandemic that we can gather across countries and time zones and places to be here today. So I'm giving it over to the panel for about another 5 minutes, and then we, as a body, are going to bless Dr. Day as we end our symposium together. Dr. Barnett, perhaps you would like to pick up first.
Oh my goodness. I will try to keep this brief. This has been so rich. The thing that I wrote down that I wanted to say I had learned the most from Katie is her assistance in thinking about the ripple effects of all the different issues that we have to address and their intersections that come together in that space we think of as public theology. For me, especially right now, what I'm wrestling with is, we speak of systemic evil. We understand the systemic nature of evil. I think that we're a long way from understanding the systemic nature of individual sin. And here's where I think Bonhoeffer offers some thoughts. Because from the very beginning of his work, he understood sin as social in nature, not just an individual flaw, but understood that social aspect of sin. And that is something that I expect the coming generations to develop and carry forward. So thank you all so much again for this very rich panel.
Dr. Howard, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I think the model of courage that my forever professor, Dr. Day, has shown outside and inside the classroom is my prayer for all of us going forward. I appreciate the courage you took in taking me on as a student, and the courage you showed every week in class to create radically democratic classrooms where you're not just sort of banking, lecturing the whole time, but it takes a lot to risk allowing a class of 50 people to share and speak up and have dialogue in there. But you let us all feel human and smart and seen. And that courage, I think, is something we can all learn from as we try to teach and preach and go our own ways. I remain deeply grateful. And I mean it when I say I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing without you. So thank you.
Rabbi Kreimer, would you like to add to your remarks?
I think I said a lot already in my talk. I just want to encourage the United Lutheran Seminary to continue the legacy of Katie Day and to continue providing opportunities for co-formation of their students with students from other faith traditions.
Thank you. And just, I remember what a delight it was to be with students from the Rabbinical College and the seminary in the same room as they discussed God and guns with Dr. Day as they looked at gun violence prevention. So thank you. Dr. Shade, would you like to add to your remarks?
I want to echo what Chaz said. I would not be doing what I'm doing now if it had not been for Katie Day. When I think about the classes and the conversations and the guidance that I've had along the way from her over these, 2 decades, I simply would not be able to have conceived of the church engaging in the way it was. This was not the way I was brought up. I was brought up with a more of an insular understanding of faith and the Christian church. And so that first class, it was just like the blinders coming off and the windows being thrown open and the wind of the Holy Spirit thrown, and you're just like, oh, like I caught my breath for the first time and didn't realize I didn't have enough air beforehand. And so every time I have conversations with her, every time I read her work, every time I'm engaging, it is like that breath of the Holy Spirit blowing into the room again. And I'm so glad for this opportunity. And I have felt those winds blowing here today.
Thank you. I want to make one brief comment from my own perspective. And Katie, I was so delighted that you ended with Bonhoeffer's kind of paradoxical image of religionless Christianity. And I think of reading that, and yet at the same time reading his letters to Maria von Wedemeyer and seeing that just the fabric of all the religious symbols around him in prison. And so I think one of the things for me going forward comes back to thinking about what might that look like and what might it be, particularly at this time in these turbulent times, to practice Christianity rather than churchianity as we go forward. I want to thank and just share the seminary's immense gratitude with our speakers today, to Dr. William Storrar, to Dr. Victoria Barnett, to Dr. Charles Howard, to Rabbi Nancy Kreimer, to Dr. Leah Shade, and particularly to Dr. Katie Day. Dr. Day, you are more active in your retirement as a scholar and as a speaker and teacher than I think I have been at any time in my academic vocation. I know when you retired, we gave you a fine chair, but we really I was so grateful that you have brought us together today. And I hope you will see, and we will save some of the chat, that you can see some gratitude and thanks and memories in it. But we wish to thank you particularly for your work and your witness and your inspiration and ongoing practice as a public theologian. And I'm going to invite everybody. It would be lovely to do if we were present together, but as a Christian, I can say I believe that Jesus can not only walk through walls, but can Zoom, incarnate through the internet. But as we gather, particularly as people across different faiths and across different countries and time zones, I invite you to go into gallery view and to stretch out your hand in blessing for Dr. Day. Katie, may the road rise to meet you. May the network be always at your back. May the sun shine warm within your passions and the rain fall softly on your protests. And until we meet again, in all that you are and all that you do, may God hold you in the hollow of God's hand. And the people say, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you
Amen.
all for being here. Dr. Day, I think we have 1 minute, and I am going to give you the last word.
Well,
It should-
that's, again, this is just overwhelming. And I surreptitiously, while you were blessing me, I took a picture of the screen. So this will be for my rainy day file, when I feel alone and not productive and not feeling it. I'm going to pull this out and remember this time.
So I'm going to invite everybody to stay on for one more moment because we have 3 screens of people. So Dr. Day, if you didn't get all of us present here.
I have 5 screens.
5 screens of people. That is so wonderful.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, coming at you, screen 2. Oh, look at you. Hi, Cindy. Oh, this is great. It is
And
wonderful.
may all of you, may the blessing of God, earth maker, pain bearer, and life giver be upon you as you go forward from this day as public theologians working and witnessing in your context in these turbulent times. Thank you all.
Thank you.